1-hour webinars over the course of 5 weeks, roughly 2 a week, and with the exception of next week and 1 week further down the line when there is only one to account for holidays. Just a reminder for everybody, please mute your mic when other people are talking, just to feedback and background noise. And since there's so many of us, raise your hand if you'd like to make a comment or speak, and people will call on you to get things going. Today's agency updates. So we'll hear from a range of the agencies starting in a minute here. And please keep in mind that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the UNOLS website and through YouTube afterwards. And with that, why don't we go ahead and start?
Great. Thanks, Craig. And welcome, everybody. And thanks for the folks who are going to be presenting today for joining us. And so without further ado, we'll jump into it. We're going to start with Bob Houtman providing the NSF update.
Okay, thanks, Doug. Hi, everyone. I'd like to start out by thanking Craig and Doug and Alice and Brandy and all of the entire UNOLS Council and Office team on developing this new virtual annual meeting approach. The first session on Monday I thought was very well done and extremely informative. I congratulate all of the stakeholders who have been so fully engaged in addressing the challenges of this new COVID world. It's a real testament of the commitment to accomplishing our mission of getting the funded science awards to sea in a safe and risk managed manner. And for me, it's just so impressive that 72 cruises have actually been successfully completed without introducing the virus on board any of the ARF ships. I think that's a fantastic result. We at NSF have recognized that this has placed significant stress on the ship operators, the awarded science teams, not only in terms of schedule planning, but also in terms of the funding of crews and teams and the added costs of testing and isolation. We have and will continue to work with everyone on helping resolve any funding issues. We were very fortunate this year in getting some additional funds from internal NSF leadership that helped fill some of these unexpected cost gaps. Speaking of the funding, we of course now are in fiscal year 2021, so happy new fiscal year. And as has been the norm over the last several years, we're in a continuing resolution, this first one until the 11th of December. We expect to get a prorated initial funding allocation relatively soon, but because we always anticipate there's a bit of a lag, we've forward funded the major facilities across NSF through the end of the calendar year. And this is as part of the FY20 closeout. And we do this in order to ensure continuity of operations across the fiscal year boundary. And as usual, we do not know what our actual budget will be for FY21. So we're not able to project beyond 11 December. But as you may recall, the FY21 President's budget request was for approximately $7.4 billion, which was about an 800 million reduction in the NSF top line from our FY20 actuals. However, this, of course, again, has been the case for the last several years. And thankfully, in each case, in each year so far, we've been fortunate to at least get level funding and even had some additional funding. And you may have also seen the very recent House FY21 appropriations bill that proposes a $270 million increase to NSF's top line above the FY20 level. So that's a pretty good delta between the Pres budget request and, at least so far, in the first step of the 21 appropriation bills, the House's proposal. As with everyone else, there are many, many activities that are ongoing in terms of programs, projects, workshops, etc. And of course, these are all in a virtual world. So the NSF team has also been essentially chained to our computers in Zoom land, which of course causes significant additional stress in the overall, particularly working from home where there's a lot of other different competing time requirements. So we're really thankful that we have these opportunities to talk about some updates on projects. The way this particular meeting is set up with sessions on different topics, most of the projects from the NSF OCE side will be covered in follow-on sessions. So I'm not going to spend time to discuss them now, but I would like to specifically say that we are just really pleased with the final outcome of the Marcus G. Langseth retirement issue. And that the final documentation step is imminent to officially complete the ownership transfer from NSF to Columbia University LDEO. As mentioned in a follow-on session, Sean Higgins will provide more details, but from NSF's perspective, this is a fantastic outcome that will keep MGL available for supporting the science community through 2024. And we really greatly appreciate the active participation by the UNOLS community over the years, essentially, that it took to address this issue and to come to this very favorable outcome. I think I'm just going to finish up by letting you know where NSF is right now in the whole COVID situation. We are in what we call phase 2 of our plan to return to occupying the NSF headquarters building. In this phase, we have selected support teams such as HR, ID cards, IT that are in the building. And there's also the option for voluntary NSF members to work in the building, but they operate under very strict protocols, including masks and social distancing and limited number of people in the elevators, etc. There is no set date for moving to phase 3, which would be a move on to full occupying the building. And that decision will be made by NSF leadership based on all of the available relevant information, including what's happening in the local communities, etc. The NSF leadership has also determined that there will be no in-person meetings or panels in the building, at least through the end of the calendar year, and it may even be extended beyond that, depending on what the situation is. And also, operationally, the essential travel for staff is very limited. So there has to be a very operational requirement in order to have approval for staff travel. So that's kind of where we are. That's a quick update from the NSF perspective. I'm going to go ahead and stop there and turn it back over to Doug and Alice and Craig.
Thanks, Bob. Greatly appreciate that update. We know it's been a challenge for the NSF staff to keep working feverishly as everybody's done through all this, despite all the disruptions caused by the pandemic and everybody working from home. So the support from NSF has been phenomenal throughout all this. So thank you. Any questions for Bob? I don't see any. So without further delay, we'll turn it over to Rob Sparrock, who's going to provide the update from the Office of Naval Research.
All right, good afternoon. Can you hear me, Doug?
Yep, hear you loud and clear, and we will have slides presented for this.
Okay.
Take it away, Rob.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Special shout out to Frank Kerr there, who will probably catch some errors that I did on purpose. I'll talk about my first error here on purpose. So we can go to next slide on funding priorities. One of the things that we do at ONR is we're focused on defense applications of research. Frank will quickly point out that the D in DRI actually stands for department, meaning it's internal to the ONR code. Here, for the sake of the audience, I used the term defense so that it was more apparent that it's really a Navy-focused initiative. These are large programs. They're chosen internal to the department, and they have kind of 5-year timeframes. But with COVID, we're kind of trying to figure out how to re-wicker these. Usually, they're the biggest source of ONR-funded science days. We want to get back both to the West Pacific, and we want to get back to the North Atlantic as part of the DRIs that we have in the upcoming years. But because we have the pause and do not want to minimize the amount of research we do overseas, and with the travel and all the other impacts it has with partners, we may see actually a decrease in overall ship time because we have to figure out how to move these DRIs with their international component in the times of COVID. Another interesting fact is that the DRIs are chosen in terms of the department, and they're not always oceanography focused. In this upcoming one, we have one that is very focused on tropical storms. Interesting, we're up to Hurricane Delta. I imagine that DRI is spending money faster than it had planned with so many storms, but one of the DRIs that we have focused is atmospheric focused, and so will not use ship time. To compensate, the Task Force Ocean program, which is mostly acoustics, continues to receive both congressional plus-up funds and internal plus-ups in order to fund acoustic projects, mostly acoustic projects that use ship time. I wanted to emphasize we're continuing to fund the Twin Otter out of the Navy Postgraduate School. There's new leadership there. I'll let that come up through SCORE, but I want to make sure the community is aware we're still funding that aircraft, that instrument, and it continues to be a valuable tool, and I hope it gets more use. As many of you know, the Navy was funding research on the Healy, and about 9 hours afterwards, there was a fire in an engine, and essentially that ended that cruise, and we scrambled to figure out how to move some of the science onto vessels out of Norway and the Sikuliak. So we tried to scramble as much as we can, but that's been a major impact. Additionally, Healy is not doing the typical Arctic plans as for 21 because it's doing a Northwest Passage. Because of COVID, we had our ships in the ability to do some maintenance periods a little bit longer, and without too much fanfare in the money, we had a lot of emergent repairs in 2020 because ships weren't operating, and we had higher repair costs than usual. We continue to fund the instrument upgrades. I'm happy to announce unofficially that the RV Atlantis will get an upgrade to the EM 124. I guess technically that formal announcement needs to come from the Department of Defense and is awaiting appropriations, but I'm pretty sure that's going to be on track. I'm sure Woods Hole is hopeful that that will remain on track since they're actually doing the work at risk in the middle of the Atlantis midlife refit. The Navy budget continues from an S&T perspective, continues to be stable. I'm concerned because where Navy funding for the research fleet typically comes from is enjoying or historically enjoys congressional plus-up, and so it's not clear how that plus-up will go. Another effort is we want to, even though the fleet is stable and there doesn't appear to be any acquisition programs anytime in the near future, we want to make sure that we're keeping these research vessels more known to, and this is more internal to the Navy, but we don't want them to be forgotten, right? But it may be a few years before we embark on another acquisition program. Finally, let me add on this slide that the Department of Defense has reorganized and placed more emphasis on science and technology. One organization I used to work with was the Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, and it was all in one big, huge super organization. That has since been split out. Higher headquarters above the Office of Naval Research, there's been some reorganization with emphasis on science and technology. So I think from a community's perspective, that trickled down of an emphasis on more, and to be honest, the emphasis is more on technology than science, but I think you'll see that getting down into how Navy is funding the UNOLS fleet and other people who are affiliated with it. And because of that, you'll see programs where we're trying to increase the number of postdocs, for example. Next slide, please. So one thing we're trying to do is also increase the number of people who use the research vessels rather than just have them very specific to the other performers within, or my peers in ONR, such as the Navy Research Lab and the Navy Oceanography Command have both used the UNOLS vessels lately, and I've been able to funnel their money to the operators. We've had some other people who are more focused on technology use the fleet, and I think that's been a good initiative. Sometimes there are contractors who don't know how the UNOLS fleet works with in terms of ship times requests, and they come directly to the operator. But since they're drawing federal funds, I'm trying not to treat them as outside contractors. In many cases, they're doing technological studies that don't necessarily fit the purely scientific mode, but we've been able to accommodate the fleet, and I think the fleet is better for it because we're providing additional sources of money, and additionally, Navy is seeing utility in these vessels. Let's see, I'm going to continue to work with any operators. If we come up with another chance to shift work to you, we'll continue to do multi-years. ONR grants are relatively slow. Interestingly enough, if anyone is out there and has recently tried to submit a grant to ONR, you'll find that you're not able to do so. A somewhat embarrassing oversight is the long-range BAA broad area announcement expired on September 30th and has not been replaced. So while it's available on the ONR website, it's not available on grants.gov. And we're aware of that, and they're making some changes to fix that. But in this current week, you're actually not able to apply to a grant to ONR. In-serve inspection. So the in-serve team, like everyone else, has been impacted by COVID. And recently, the frequency of in-serves changed from 5 years to 3 years. The bottom line, though, is we're not going to try to do any in-serves in 2021. Kila Moana underwent a service life evaluation done by ABS, and it's a probabilistic document. So it doesn't say 20 years per se. There's a lot of how much fatigue life and some situational that are variable. But in short, the bottom line is the vessel's still good for another 20 years, and we may have to improve the auxiliary systems in that time to keep it. But the good news is the physical hull is certainly sustainable, and I imagine because of that, Kila Moana will continue to enjoy a long service life like many of the other global ships. I have talked to some people individually, but just wanted to say this in front of the group. There is a motor vessel Independence. It has a ROV. It's operated by the Navy Research Lab out of Port Hueneme, and that group is focused primarily on Navy research focused to Seabees. But they have expertise in undersea cables and other aspects that there's some overlap with oceanography. To be honest, their vessel is about the size of an RCRV. It's got a lot of deck space, but it's certainly not as capable from an oceanographic perspective. The good news is this particular group had only one tool. So they have a budget and they spend money to do at-sea research. But because they were not really aware of the UNOLS fleet, they're limited in their thought to using the motor vessel independence. Increasing their awareness that the entire academic research fleet is at their disposal, I hope that they will embark on additional research projects using the broader fleet. And then finally, we're in the process of continuing our divestment of FLIP. I think that will happen soon. If you have any good ideas, you can share those with me and Bruce Applegate. We've had all kinds of crazy ideas, from wearing virtual reality goggles in a static model of FLIP to sticking it on a carnival ride and letting people flip around at carnival ride speeds. But with that, I'll finish and welcome any comments or questions on the Navy and the Greater Department of Defense support to the academic research fleet.
Thanks, Rob. Appreciate the update. And also, similarly to what I mentioned earlier, thanks so much for your outstanding support throughout the virus. Certainly helping us keep the ships in the crews employed, the ships operational and prepared and ready to go back to sea to do science. So thanks for that unwavering support.
Oh, thank you. And I hope at least Frank might have a question.
I'm looking, I don't see a hand raised yet, but you must have dazzled
You're
everybody.
on mute, Frank.
Sorry. Hey, Rob, I'm sorry to hear about the divestment of FLIP. I'm not too surprised, but can you tell me just a few words more about that?
Sure. The Naval Historical Society has done a virtual tour to take a look at the vessel. From a budget perspective, we were looking at a $6 to $8 million bill to fix it. We had done some user community base to see, what kind of interest there was. The interest was not balanced against the increased cost of keeping FLIP alive for, at $8 million, we were looking at 5 to 7 more years of service life and then seeing what we would do with that next. We have, as an agency, invested in some similar technology, certainly not as great as FLIP, but we've had Durrups on buoys, other spar buoys that can do similar things. The Class C DRI, supported by Reggie Beach, working on Sally Ride next year in Monterey Bay, will use buoys similar to the configuration of FLIP, but not as capable. The other thing that's happened with UCSD is we've lost a lot of the talent to safely operate the vessel. So in addition to the cost of bringing it back, it would also incur the ability to retrain the people to keep that. If I were to guess, I am hopeful that the ship will be cut at the 300-foot mark, and hopefully the 300-foot mark will find a useful life either as a reef or as recycling, and the top 55 feet of the ship may show up someplace as a museum or museum-like display somewhere on the main campus or the Scripps campus at UCSD. But thank you for that question.
Well, thank you. And I recognize a lot of those issues. 50 plus years, a lot of use for that platform. It did a great job. Scripps did a great job with it too.
Yeah, it feels bad to be the guy involved with killing it. It gives me no sense of pleasure or accomplishment. I'm just hoping we can find a useful, an appropriate place for it to have honor after its useful operational life.
Right. Thanks.
Thanks, Frank. And thanks, Rob. Any other questions for Rob? Very good. Now we're going to turn it over to Claire Marsden-Surrey, who's going to provide an update for NOAA. And we'll have slides to that as well. Claire, are you there?
I am. Can you guys see/hear me?
Sure can, loud and clear.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks. So thanks, as always, for having us as part of the agency updates. And, off the bat, I'll just thank you again for all of the collaboration and information exchange that we have found very helpful, and I hope vice versa, dealing with the COVID-19 situation. So today I'll talk very briefly about how NOAA has been faring through this, what we've been able to salvage out of this fiscal year thus far, and looking forward some of our initiatives. So next slide. Yep, and actually you could just go right through to the next one too. So this is a brief overview of what we experienced with the pandemic, just like everybody else. So we had, for the first time, most of our ships in repair during Q1, which was something that was supposed to set us up really well for maintenance for the rest of the year moving forward, to sort of stretch out our field season and get our days of sea up to a place where we prefer them. And we were sort of on our way there until we recalled the entire fleet on the 18th of March. They all went to a NOAA home port and stayed in port for the safety of all personnel on board for the coronavirus response. The only ship that we had operating during Q3, there's actually a couple of them. The Ron Brown was off the coast of South Africa and needed to be recalled home. She ended up staying off the coast for a few days just to ensure that there weren't anybody with symptoms, and then they came home. And we had the NOAA ship Thomas Jefferson, who is our primary response vessel for hurricane preparedness on the East Coast, of course, and she was ready and taking on any potential tasking for Q3. So Q4, on July 1st, we began reconstituting all of the other assets. So that includes all of the other ships as well as our aircraft that were not involved in hurricane response. And as of today, actually this number, 12 out of our 15 active ships is now closer to 13. It's 13 out of our active 15 ships that have been reconstituted or have gotten underway in support of NOAA prioritized requirements. So that was either for operational readiness training to shake the rust off for the crew and the ship as well, or science projects. Once we got going, each ship, depending on its level of maintenance, few of the ships had to were interrupted in the middle of their maintenance packages, restricting access during the peak of the coronavirus pandemic around the country. So some ships needed to pick up where they had left off on the maintenance. And so there was various levels of the time it took to reconstitute. Some ships were within a month, some took a little bit longer. And as I'll go through along the way, we did have some delays due to some positive cases that came up either through testing or through the evidence of symptoms while all of the ships were in port. So while we were reconstituting our crew, getting that maintenance kind of back on track, there were some cases that came up that were dealt with. So we have to date operated from 13 US ports. Jumping ahead a little bit, the plan is to continue operating potentially in foreign ports as allowed, solely based on the testing capability of our vendors, which I'll talk about a little bit. But we are in the planning process of trying to get a few ships to foreign ports. The Rainier and the Dyson had the extra efforts to be mitigated for risk, working beyond the 250 nautical mile in 48 hours. So some ships had to travel very long distances, and so we mitigated that with testing, near shore, waiting periods, things like that. And then, of course, we had some emergency response following Isaias, and the Thomas Jefferson was on that one. And all told for this fiscal year, we had 917 full days at sea, which is of course a far cry from what we had planned. The plan before everything happened was somewhere around 22750. Once all of the ships were put in port, we had to rework that. And so there was a lot of efforts behind the scenes and collaboratively to try to get what we could, salvage what we could after the 1st of July. And we ended up with, it was 275 sea days in the fourth quarter. All right. Next slide, please. All right, so I'll chat a little bit about some of our NOAA safety protocols. We call them safety nets for a reason. It's a widespread combination of various methods we had in place to catch and identify positive cases before any ships went out to sea. So before even people were traveling back, they were tested, they were screened for COVID symptoms. Our medical folks, as most of you know here on the phone call, we have a cadre of public health service officers that we recently put the numbers up, which was very fortuitous because we needed every single one of those public health service officers as assistance during this time. So 32,000 medical screenings. That was everybody from crew coming back to the ships from having been home. That was contractors that were coming on board, and we caught quite a few contractors that had potential positive symptoms that we did not allow on board. Shelter in place period of no less than 7 days, and really when you combine them with a lot of the pre-screening requirements we had for people and contractors, it ended up being a little bit more than 7 days. But the very strict shelter in place where people were either in hotel rooms or under strict shelter in place protocols in their own homes, and that involved, you know, if you were with somebody who could not keep a shelter in place protocol with you, then you were not considered sheltered in place. Also included daily symptoms. At about day 4 or 5, every single person was tested for the COVID-19 using our PCR testing. We did quite a bit of market research. We have an IDIQ out for our vendors, and they had to reach this very stringent 95% sensitivity and 98% specificity criteria. We had only 2 vendors that could prove, small business vendors that could prove that to us, and they have been very good to work with. And they've been able to turn around quite quickly results, sometimes in as little as 48 hours, or most of the time less than 48 hours. We are adding a second test. It's already been implemented to increase that sensitivity to 99% as a combined rate. So that will help sort of allay any of the potential fears that we had been hearing feedback from, that the one test wasn't quite enough. And to date, we've had over 2,000 tests administered. And actually, we had 2 recently in the past couple of days. So that's 8 positives or 10 positives, no positives on board. These were all caught, like I said, when we were in our phase 3. So we have a phased guidance, and they were caught and contact traced. And so that ended up being a positivity rate of 1.2%, which we felt was pretty good considering the size of our and dispersity of our workforce. So we've been operating under 45-day at sea bubbles. followed by 16 days in port. So that 16 days includes everything from crew rest, any kind of maintenance that came up, a repeated shelter in place and testing before anybody can get back on and sail. So OMAO, Office of Marine and Aviation Operations under NOAA, is paying for all the tests being done, of course, to our crew and to all of the scientific personnel that board. We're doing regular disinfecting in our operational environments. That 45 days is mostly a guideline. We had the Oscar Dyson just returned from its trip to the Arctic Circle, had a 58-day bubble as the project mandated or needed to really get done. So, and that 16 days in port is really meant to be a break for the crew to be able to break protocol, break shelter in place within reason. And so we don't stretch out morale too far. So just an example, so of our safety net. So we had 2 crew members test positive on a ship while we were in this shelter in place stage. Those individuals were not allowed on the ship, and the ship did not sail as planned. So again, it's an example of catching these cases and not allowing them on board, and the protocols were tested all over again. And a lot of times if we had science parties that were unable to join a particular project, the crew of the ships took on quite a bit. Either it was moorings or various things that were sort of given to us for responsibility. So it was challenging for sure, but we definitely found some ways to make it work and get back out there. The next slide, please. All right, so for next year, we're planning fiscal year 21 in this 45-day, 16-day break stance for the entire year. If we find that we can relax these measures later on in the fiscal year, we're hopeful for that, but we're not planning to it. Again, all of our contract repairs have already been awarded, and they're for either Q1 or Q2 in most cases. So trying to get as much of the field seasons, as we can into the fiscal year 21. We'll continue with collaborations between all of the line offices. So OMAO does not work in a bubble, of course. We support fisheries and hydro and Office of, Ocean and Atmospheric Research. So we continue to work collaboratively with them through this whole planning process. And then some other sort of updates I just wanted to give you. We do have a new, what used to be called our fleet tracker. It's the NOAA Platform Awareness Dashboard. And I can include the link to go out with the next informational slide. But it has not only the NOAA ships, but the aircraft and gliders that we have out and we're tracking. So it's a pretty neat system. We continue with our recapitalization plans. We're working with the Navy on our AGOR variant, and we're still working on design and requirements for our research vessel class B and C's. And today we just released the OMAO strategic plan. So for the next 5 years, people-driven performance is sort of our main message there. And if anybody is interested in a copy of that, I can definitely send it along. And I have been sending along to Dr. Russell any protocols that we have and that we have been updating. So if anybody is in need of that, please let myself or the organizers know. And so next slide. With that, I'll stand by for any questions. And thanks very much again for having me.
Thanks, Claire. I appreciate that update. I also greatly appreciate the collaboration we've had with you, Rear Admiral Hahn, Commander Simon, the rest of the NOAA community. So it has been great. We've all been working together on this. So trying to solve this challenge.
Yep.
Congratulations
Absolutely.
again to be back out to work.
That's right.
Any questions for Claire from anybody? Oh, I see. I just saw a hand from somebody. Who was that? It was quick. Oh, Suzanne Carbot has a question.
Yes. Hi, Claire. I'm wondering about your 7-day shelter in place protocol, because for the UNOLS fleet, we've been using 14 days quarantine before, which is, I'm wondering about the difference and how that, how you came to the 7-day protocol.
Absolutely. So we have been working, as I mentioned, very closely with our public health service officers who were doing very extensive research with all of the peer-reviewed articles that were coming out. We, of course, know about the CDC 14-day quarantine recommendation. What it basically came down to was the return on investment for that extra 7 days when you weighed it against crew shelter in place fatigue, the potential for people to sort of break shelter in place if they had to do it for maybe more than 14 days as a risk assessment model. And basically the returns, you know, the amount of potential positive cases that could have been caught in that 7 days just wasn't feasible for the complexity of the operations that we have with our 16 vessels and various line offices, various science parties. And so once we sort of combined those ahead of time screenings with the very strict 7-day shelter in place and our, as I said, our safety net, our extremely sensitive case tests that were being administered only by 2 vendors and administered in a very controlled way by OMAO. We decided that that was the best way to move forward. So it was a risk analysis and an operational, combination of what we thought was the best way moving forward. So to date, our safety net has been working. As I mentioned, we caught not only the 10 wage mariners, but also several contractors from coming on board the ships.
Great, thank
That
you.
answers. Yep.
Yep.
Other questions for
Claire? I've got a question. Oh, go ahead, Doug.
Oh, go ahead, Alice. Thanks.
I was just curious about how far offshore your vessels are working. You mentioned they might be going into foreign ports next year, but right now, are they generally closer to shore? Because I think that makes a difference too in protocols. Go ahead.
Absolutely. So we currently have 2 ships that are underway. There's 4 or 5 more that are getting ready. They're in their bubble break right now. Most of those will be operating relatively close to shore. A few of them will be offshore by a little bit, 250 miles or so. And so we enact that sort of extra hanging by the coast a little bit longer just to make sure no one is experiencing any symptoms. Of course, everyone, we require that masks stay on for the entire cruise, regardless of timeout. We might consider loosening that a little bit later. Of course, disinfecting and all of that good stuff. We are planning at fiscal year 21. It's almost completely planned, and there are potential ships, Ron Brown, that might be going into foreign ports, and we are that is the last piece of our puzzle here, actually, for finality of our planning. And we are working with our vendors to see how plausible it is to have these tests. So these tests are shelf stable, as I'm sure most of you know. It can be administered by a medical professional. We prefer the medical professional be one of the vendors, or it can be done by one of our NOAA medical professionals. The trick then is getting these tests shipped properly, because they have to be shipped back to the vendor's lab, get them shipping on time within the 5-day time frame. So that's the challenge that we're working with foreign ports now. And of course, foreign ports that would not necessarily allow U.S. flag vessels in is a challenge. We will not be disallowing, I guess I would say, any pilots on board where compulsory pilotage exists, and we'll have pretty strict no contact rules and PPE rules in those cases. But that's what we're working through with this particular fiscal year. whether or not we end up actually going to many foreign ports is still kind of to be determined.
Great, thanks, Claire. Appreciate all the further amplification of these things, helpful for all of us. With that, let's move on to the State Department update provided by the team of Emma Tully, Amanda Williams, and Gabrielle David.
Good afternoon. We do have some slides that I believe Alice is sharing. My name is Amanda Williams, and we also have Gabriella David and Emma Tully on. They just turned on their videos as well, if you can see them. While we're getting the slides up, I'll let you know that those who are dedicated RATS users and are waiting with bated breath for this server migration to complete, we just found out that it's in its final phase of testing. So we really hope that RATS is going to be up before the end of the week. So hopefully, we'll be back to normal very soon. It's been a stressful week, hoping that the server migration that it was undergoing was successful. So Allison Reed's not with us today because she's on a well-deserved vacation up in Maine with her family. So it's just the three of us today. Next slide, please. So we realize so many of you have seen a lot of these refresher slides before. I'm just going to go over a couple slides, and then Gabby and Emma will talk about what's new in 2020, especially with what's been going on with COVID for us. Just a reminder that coastal states have the right to conduct MSR, and they also have the right to regulate jurisdiction over MSR conducted within their own waters, so the territorial sea and the exclusive economic zone. The Law of the Sea Convention outlines these various articles about those points, and Article 250 is the one that says that MSR projects shall be made through appropriate official channels. So that's why State Department's here, and that's why we're involved. Next slide, please. So as you know, MSR consent is complicated, and we really appreciate all your patience with this process. So with new technologies like AUVs, sail drones, as they're constantly evolving and changing, the optics could be changing too. Geopolitics is always an issue, disputed maritime boundaries, sovereignty claims, those types of things. So another reason why coming to State Department is so key, since we are the ones that manage those relationships. We can't rely solely on past practice. Relationships and situations are constantly evolving. So just because something went a certain way 5 years ago when you last did research in this country doesn't mean it's going to be the same today necessarily. We realize it's a cumbersome bureaucratic process, but it's necessary. And while we like to think consent is guaranteed, it's never the case. And as we said, situations can change. We've had a lot of evolving issues this year with COVID, of course, relating to that. So we jokingly say we're like a good neighbor. State Department is there because we're involved for all these above reasons. Next slide, please. As many of you may have heard, actually, we had an update to our MSR policy. This will not really affect this crowd because this has to do more with foreign scientists wishing to conduct research in the US EEZ. So previously, there were only certain instances where the need to apply for consent was triggered. So now we're basically bringing ourselves in alignment with all the other countries around the world and being consistent with international law. So this applies to our EEZ and on the continental shelf. Consent was always required in the territorial sea. So let us know if you have any questions about this proclamation, but like I said, it really shouldn't affect this group. Next slide, please. So I'll turn it over to Gabby in a couple slides, but we're going to focus on the U.S. scientists in foreign waters, which is this crowd. Next slide, please. Sorry, I hope you don't hear my dog chewing on her toy. So like I said before, this is a very bureaucratic process. You can see all the different steps. The large circles are the ones that the State Department is involved in, and then you guys are involved in various other steps, but there's so many steps to this process. So we really appreciate your patience and understanding when we say submit early. Next slide, please. Now I'll turn it over to Gabby and I'll mute myself.
Thanks, Amanda. Hi, everyone. So here's a map that Emma Tully actually created, just showing the many coastal states that we received applications for this year so far in 2020. So in 2020, we've had 221 applications in total. 10 have been rescheduled and 53 have been canceled. This won't affect, if you were any of the canceled applications, it won't affect you applying for research in the future. The embassies are very understanding. This is hard on all of us, the embassies, the coastal states. So everybody's kind of adapting to the COVID-19 pandemic. So don't worry about future research. Next slide, please. We just wanted to talk about some of the trends and challenges. So that 6-month application deadline is so important now. The embassies, like I said, are understaffed. You know, everybody's teleworking. There's a lot of restrictions. Even in the coastal states, we're having issues just because it's so much going on. So as early as you can get those applications in, please do. And all the requirements. Also reports. We do appreciate the UNOLS community. Since our last meeting, we've had so many outstanding reports come in. We definitely appreciate it. The coastal states are happy. But when there are outstanding reports, coastal states can withhold consent against the vessel or the nationality of the scientist or whatever they want, really. So we kind of have to get these applications in. So please be aware of that. And I think Emma will talk more about reporting later. And then we already touched on COVID and all the extreme events that can come. So a lot of planning and applications in early. Next slide, please. So some more trends, timing of requirement changes of the coastal state has now become a bigger issue. For example, Barbados just kind of revamped their application processing altogether. So now we had an application to Barbados, and halfway through the review period, they let us know that now a whole committee has to review the application. And after the committee signs off on it, then it gets elevated to the prime minister's level and they have to issue the consent. So we are still getting consent for these cruises, but it's significantly delayed. So if you have any plans to go to Barbados, please keep that in mind. The timing and forms of documents for additional observers, and if you have any new standard operating procedures with COVID-19 and anything like that, just let us know as early as possible, because coastal states are still wanting to get engaged. And we do like to, engage local scientists also. It's really important for diplomatic relations, but it's just a lot more planning. So please keep that in mind when you submit these applications. And we have seen an increase in challenges with port call visits, also due to COVID-19. So things to keep in mind. Next slide, please. All of our updated guidance can be found on our Marine Science Guidance page. It should be hyperlinked here if you guys have a copy of these slides. Bahamas has a moratorium on sampling. We know this has affected some of you a bunch. It can be difficult if there is any sampling on the applications. So please be aware of that. I think the moratorium will be lifted next month. So we'll keep an eye on that one. I told you about Barbados. It can be a little tricky. Canada has had some updates with their port calls, so keep that in mind. We get a ton of applications to Canada. And Cuba is still complicated, even though they are still accepting applications. So next slide, please. And France has been really strict on their deadlines, and they're 6.5 months for any French territories. We ask that you get applications in for France like at least 7 months in advance, if possible, only because we need time to review it also. And then more turnover with staffing and things like that. We've seen a lot of challenges there. And they're very, very strict on their reports. And France will actually follow up and ping us for outstanding reports before they issue consent. So if you're one of those people who've had cruises in the past at French territories, please make sure that those reports are in. Mexico has had significant delays due to COVID-19. if you all have had any cruises to Mexico, you know that there's an extensive review process. A lot of documents are needed, but now they're having delays due to COVID. So we've received consent for the 2 cruises that we've had so far since COVID-19 started, really, but they were both significantly delayed, and consent was issued way after the start date. So keep that in mind if you're planning to go to Mexico. Philippines has lifted their MSR ban, so we're excited to start seeing some more research in the Philippines. We haven't had a application begin yet, but we have some in the works. So we're really excited to see if those go through. And then all of the additional documents for the Solomon Islands can be found on our guidance page. Next slide, please. And I will turn it over to Emma here to talk to you more about reporting.
Hi everyone, I'm Emma. I'm new to the MSR team at State, so it's nice to meet y'all. And I'm just going to quickly touch upon missing reports again. Once again, thanks so much for everyone who has handed in their reports. We've received a huge influx in the past few months, but we still do have hundreds of missing reports, and it's really essential to be getting these reports in because Coastal State can withhold consent for any US scientist, regardless if you've submitted all your reports. If your colleague hasn't, then there is that chance that consent can be denied. So it's important that we all work together to make sure that these guidelines are met. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick refresher for everyone on who requests MSR consent. So most coastal states, it's the flag state of the vessel who submits the application. We in the US, we do it a little differently. We ask for the nationality of the chief scientist to submit the request. And then Canada, it's the owner of the data. And it's just very good practice for y'all to be aware of whether you should be the one that's requesting the consent or not. Next slide, please. So just a quick rundown on some helpful tips to make sure your application goes smoothly. As we've mentioned multiple times before, please submit as early as possible. With COVID, it's just complicated matters a lot, so the earlier the better. Another tip that we have is to feel free to talk to your other colleagues for lessons learned. I'm sure you all have a wealth of information. The next tip is to build in a time buffer. So 1 week at the end of the day range that you actually do plan on conducting your research. That just provides good flexibility. And we don't want any maritime boundaries on our cruise track. That's very important. Once again, we request around 7 months of leeway, so submit as early as possible. Another tip is the people who will be looking over your applications probably don't have a scientific background, so make it a point to sell your science, the benefits, and to keep that in mind when you write with your tone. The next 2 points aren't probably that feasible in our current time, but the coastal states, typically they do really love it when you engage with local scientists, conduct some public diplomacy outreach. So that's just something to keep in mind for the future. And whenever you do have any updates on your application or like date changes or chief scientist changes, please let us know so we can let all the actors know. And once again, please submit your reports on time because it's just a good practice to have this goodwill between the coastal states. It helps build trust, and also you are abiding by the consent letter, which is very important. And once again, please submit as early as possible. Next slide, please. And here are some hyperlinks to some various resources we have on our state.gov site. I think the one that's probably the most useful for everyone is the documentation required by coastal state. And we do, every time we get any sort of update on the documents, we update that site as soon as possible. So it's up to date data. Next slide, please. And this is just, you know, all of our faces. You do see us on screen, but just so you're aware of who each of us are. And Allison couldn't join us today. So Next slide, please. And that is the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for listening. And if you do have any follow-up questions or need to reach us for anything, feel free to email us at marinescience@state.gov. And everyone on the team gets the emails that are sent to that particular address. So one of us will be able to help you. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Amanda, Emma, and Gabriella. There are some questions. The first one is from Amy Bako-Taylor, and where did that just go? I just had it a minute ago.
I can see it.
Yep.
The question is there any paperwork required for MSR in international waters? So we don't deal with that so much directly. These are requests that will be in somebody's territorial sea, EEZ, or on their continental shelf. Somebody else may be able to answer this from the UNOLS community, but if there's something in the BB&J areas, biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, Allison's really our resident expert on that, and unfortunately I don't know the answer to that, but does anybody else know about BB&J or other restrictions?
I think my experience generally is with international waters, we usually didn't have to worry about clearances for doing work, but I'm not so sure about the biodiversity piece. I know it's becoming a much bigger issue these days. So if anybody's any doubt, they should reach out to the State Department, specifically Allison, to ask that question.
You can still use that same email, Gistro, the marinescience@state.gov. She'll check it. But yeah, Doug's exactly right. Typically, in terms of mapping or any other, anything that's not doing biodiversity studies like genetic studies, typically you won't need paperwork. I just don't know about the BB&J portion.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Amanda. I see Jim Swift has a question.
Yes, thank you. How do you know you have an overdue or outstanding report?
Emma and Gabby have these wonderful spreadsheets. So if you have a RATS account, you can sign into RATS and check once it's back online, check the status of whether you have any outstanding tasks. But Emma and Gabby have these wonderful spreadsheets that we track by chief scientists. And I believe they had sent one to UNOLS that went around to the community. So if you haven't heard about your outstanding reports, you might want to check in with Alice.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Any final questions for the State Department team, which we greatly appreciate you joining us. I have one comment before I forget. So I don't know if any of you listened in on our talk on Monday. The UNOLS, the academic research ships with the UNOLS designated vessels, right now we're not planning on any foreign ports to operate from, at least until the middle of 2021. We just have to see how the pandemic plays out and how foreign ports start to open up in the future. So, so right now, I don't expect you'll see a lot of requests from our community, at least on the academic research fleet ships. But
okay, yeah, earlier this summer, we were getting a lot of pushback, people saying, don't even count on a port call. But now, like Canada, you can make a port call, you just can't disembark. So obviously, it's just going to be a fluid situation as this all plays out. But yeah, we'll always be happy to reach out and find out what the port call situation is whenever you are ready to start doing port calls again. But thanks for that.
Well, that's great advice for all our operators as they do cruise planning. So I know Woods Hole, for instance, has been working that with Iceland, Greenland, and Canada for some of the cruises they've been doing on the Neil Armstrong.
Yeah, we stay in close contact with Carrie.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks so much for your update today, and great to see all of you. Sorry we missed Allison, but glad she's on vacation.
Thank you.
With that, we have one more presentation planned for today, and that is with Brian Midson, who's going to talk about the interagency work group on ocean and coastal mapping. I don't think he has any slides, does he, Alice?
I normally don't have any slides.
He does.
Oh.
He does. I'm just trying to get my computer to work over here.
So I put in slides because I'm going to start out with some bureaucracy and then end up with some more, information relevant for this community. But I wanted people to have this as a resource if they ever wanted to know what the relationship between the different government bodies is on these committees we talk about.
Okay, Brian, I'm having a little bit of a technical difficulty here.
Okay, well.
Give me just 1 minute. You can start talking and I will get
I can
your
talk
slides
through it.
up.
So what I'm going to show is basically a wiring diagram that explains where the authority for the Interagency Working Group on Ocean and Coastal Mapping derives. So it all starts off at the White House level, but there's an Ocean Policy Committee, and the Ocean Policy Committee is co-chaired by the Office of Science and Technology Policy and the Council on Environmental Quality. So that's my first slide. So next slide. Locked me up.
Can you guys see my screen? You can't see my screen?
Yeah,
Yes,
but it's not in presentation
Okay.
mode.
Oh, thank you. There we go. How about now?
It's still not in presentation mode.
yeah, it's not in slideshow, no.
Oh my goodness. Gotta love it. My apologies.
So anyway, what's going to be in those first couple of slides is the relationship between the different bodies. So the Ocean Policy Committee oversees two bodies. One is the Ocean Resource Management Subcommittee, and I'm not going to talk about them. That's the more commercial side. And then there's the Ocean Science and Technology Subcommittee, OST, which also serves as the Subcommittee on Ocean Science and Technology. So SOST, you'll hear a lot. So underneath the SOST, okay, you can go to the next slide, that's fine. Underneath the SOST, there's a relatively new body. It's the National Ocean Mapping, Exploration, and Characterization, NOMEC Council. And the NSF representative to that body is Candace Major. It's co-chaired by NOAA and USGS. And that's the body that oversees the two interagency working groups I'm going to talk about. The first is the Interagency Working Group on Ocean and Coastal Mapping. That body's been around for a while, since about 2008, and I've been on it since its inception. And there's a new body, the Interagency Working Group on Ocean Exploration and Characterization. And I'll describe the roles of those two bodies next. So next slide. Strange presentation mode, that's okay. So in November of last year, the president issued a memo on ocean mapping of the US EEZ. Within that memo, agencies were directed to come up with a strategy to map the entire EEZ of the United States, and separately, more specifically, the nearshore Alaska region. So the IWG-OCM, the Ocean and Coastal Mapping Group, was tasked with producing this strategy within 60 days, next slide, and did so. And what was published is what you see here. In June, the strategy for mapping, exploring, and characterizing the EEZ came out. Within it, there were a couple of features like the need to prioritize areas for after the mapping is completed, prioritizing areas for further exploration and characterization, and also coming up with a standard ocean mapping protocol, which I'll describe at the very end of this. Next slide. The OCM also produced a strategy for mapping the coast of Alaska. Those are separate strategies, as I mentioned before. So the next phase of this process is taking that strategy and making an implementation plan. And that's where that newly stood up IWG on Ocean Exploration and Characterization comes into play. That newly formed body is charged with developing the implementation plan, which has more of the nuts and bolts. Who's going to do what, where the resource is going to come from, who's going to pay for it. And the NSF rep to that body is Kevin Johnson in the Marine Geology and Geophysics program. Next slide. So I'm throwing this map up there, and a couple of things I want to say about it. People have been showing this for a little while. This was kind of the baseline from where everything started, the unmapped region, either below or above 200 meters of water depth. It's often bandied about that about 40% of the US EEZ had been mapped to a standard we probably wouldn't consider usable for most of the things we do. But I also want to throw out there that perhaps a layer like this could be included in the new MFP, so people can really see if where they're proposing is included in some of these unmapped areas, knowing that there's a strategy and an implementation plan to get those areas mapped. Just a thought. Next slide. Okay, so last thing I want to talk about is that standard ocean mapping protocol that I described in the strategic plan. Over the last 2 days, in fact, I hopped from that meeting to this one, a symposium has been held to really bring in perspectives from non-governmental bodies, from researchers, from industry, from all fields. And these are the topics that we've been talking about for the last few days. I'm not going to go through each one, but I would like to emphasize that it was a common theme throughout all of the discussions about the value the academic research fleet could bring to meeting these objectives, and that folks need to keep in mind use of these vessels in a charter mode or in a planning mode, because they've already contributed a significant amount of the data that's filling in the gaps that I showed in that in the map. One thing I do want to call out specifically here of these topic areas, well, all of the topic areas we went through in pretty good detail. That is, what are the resolutions? What are the frequencies? What's the gear needed to do it? There was an emphasis on the need for obtaining ground truthing to really validate whatever type of measurement is being made, whether it's for reflectivity, and grab samples to really characterize the seabed surface, or coring to validate sub-bottom profiling. It was a really, really good discussion. One thing I'm going to throw out here is the water column. So there is, the mapping the ocean includes that part that's the ocean. It's not just mapping the seabed. So there was a discussion about indeed mapping that water column, particularly using echo sounders and multi-beam systems to really look at the backscatter from water properties that could be derived from that kind of data. So that was a real good topic of discussion we just had this afternoon. A lot of participants you would all recognize. Suzanne Carbat was there. I saw her here too. But others, Larry Mayer is a prominent contributor, and Paul Johnson and Vicky Farini for data issues. Was a really good 2-day symposium, and I think we'll get a lot out of it. The last thing I wanted to say about those contributions was, Larry's repeated point that that more value could be derived from these systems if we took a leave everything on all the time approach. It was recognized that creates some problems with specific equipment interferences and other technical issues, but there was a real drive for that sort of approach. Even if it's not for your particular field, consider running whatever system's available if it doesn't interfere. So that's really all I wanted to say. The IWG-OCM meets tomorrow to start organizing into writing teams to flesh out these standard ocean mapping protocols. And I'm glad to hear any input or answer any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. That was very informative and an important subject. I can quickly talk to we mentioned about MFP. There's no reason why we can't bring that kind of information into MFP as one of the layers in their graphics. I don't know if you were watching the other day, I showed a quick example, and I think we've already talked to them briefly about this, and that's not a problem down the road to do it. So that could help people with planning to, like, I think like you're intimating, like you move over a little bit, you can grab an area on your way out on a transit, for example, versus the tried and true, we always take that track line. So we will be glad to keep that in mind as we're working on the MFP requirements. Are there other questions or comments for Brian before we wrap up for the day?
Yeah,
Liz?
I have a question. Yeah,
Yeah.
I might have missed it. I might have missed it, but why is Alaska, the plan for Alaska, separate from all the rest? Is that because of the size or because of different concerns?
Both. So as everyone, well, as most people will recognize, really difficult to map in shallow water, and there's a lot of shallow water around the coastline of Alaska. There's also an emphasis on not just the water depth, but the coast itself. And one of the tools and one of the expert bodies uses a thing called the bathotopy LiDAR. It's a bathymetric and topographic LiDAR system that can give you the coastal definition as well as nearshore features down to a relatively shallow depth. So that airborne tool will likely be one of the predominant ones used for the Alaska strategy. Whereas the strategy for the rest of the US EEZ basically had to start somewhere. So the first plan will likely cut it off at starting at 40 meters. So it'll be mapping from 40 meters and deeper as part of the first. So it's a quite different approach between the EEZ mapping and the Alaska coastal mapping.
Thanks.
Is there for the coastal mapping, is there a resolution standard that's being applied in terms of doing the surveys?
Absolutely, and that's what we've been discussing the last couple of days. And the whole idea of being fit for purpose and maximizing return on the tools that are available and using the right tool for the right job. It's a depth-dependent resolution, and the agencies that have missions are contributing to what their needs for those resolutions are, as well as the researchers who need to answer questions, to make meaningful these data, whether it's for ecological, geological, or other process approaches.
Yeah, I was on a Zoom just before this meeting, and a person talking about the coastal mapping said the resolution of the maps would be 100 meters. And of course, it's going to vary with water depth and so on, but 100 meters seemed awfully large.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of that number. And what gets bandied about is the definition that informed that map I showed at first. It had something to do with a single measurement within 100-meter grid spacing made since 1960. That counted as mapped. That isn't likely to be what the standard ocean mapping protocol comes up with as a needs-based solution.
Yeah, it'd be good if these things were also scientifically useful, let's say. But there are also other considerations about what the resolution should be. And of course, because of those different water depths, it's going to vary. So yeah, I understand. Thank you.
Welcome.
Suzanne Carbot has a question for you, Brian.
Brian, I'm wondering if off the West Coast EEZ, the gap analysis indicates there's a fair amount of data out there, but as we know, it's multi-generation, a real patchwork. Do you think there's any possibility that this effort could lead to more homogeneous mapping of the West Coast EEZ?
I absolutely think so. And as you well know, a much better source for usable data, will come out of GMRT or something like that. That map, is notional at best. And again, it fits that definition I was describing. Somebody had to start with something. And that also informs the back of the envelope calculation of how many ship years it would take at, a given level of effort to complete. Can argue about those outcomes, but that's just a starting point.
Great, thanks.
Well, thanks, Brian. Again, that was, go ahead. Is there a question?
Doug, this is David. Can I?
Absolutely.
Brian, I was very glad to hear that you're considering the water column signal, and just hope that people with the right expertise will continue working with your working group on that. I think they're really right for some.
Yeah, there's a lot of interest in that data for very applied reasons, not just fisheries, but also methane seep identification. BOEM has an interest in that for their legal requirements and permitting. Yeah, it was a very robust discussion.
Okay. I think we're just about done for today.